The vote was not close. That was the part Inari kept returning to. Not the margin. She had expected the margin, had run the political models herself 6 times in the weeks before the session, had watched the coalition calcify into inevitability with the particular cold clarity that came from understanding exactly how other minds worked. The margin was not the surprise. The surprise was the silence after. SSK Thara had been watching from the upper diplomatic gallery when the final tally resolved across the chamber's bioluminescent display. 412 member species in formal accord, 17 abstentions, 1 vote against. The one against had been humanity's own representative, a procedural gesture that cost nothing and changed nothing, a single copper coin thrown into an ocean. But the silence that followed the announcement was not the silence of resolution. It was the silence of a room waiting to see what would break. The humans did not break. Inari stood at the species lectern, a tall woman by human standards, darker-skinned than most of her delegation, with close-cropped hair going silver at the temples, and she read the expulsion decree in full without interrupting herself. Her pheromone signature, as SSK Thara's olfactory array parsed it, carried none of the volatility she had learned to associate with primate distress. No cortisol-adjacent compounds, no adrenaline bloom. The biochemical markers of grief were simply absent. SSK Thara filed this as data corruption and flagged it for review. The decree itself was not inhumane, as these things went. Humanity would retain its ships, its technology, its corporate structures and accumulated wealth. What it would not retain was access to conclave station networks, to the interstellar trade corridors, to the diplomatic relay systems that connected 3,000 inhabited worlds. The Shear was offered as territory, a designation that required heavy diplomatic lifting to call it that, given that the Shear was a band of deep outer-arm space, notable primarily for its radiation flux, its gravitational instability, and the 17 previous species that had surveyed it and collectively decided it was good for nothing. Humanity was being handed the galaxy's attic. The vote was framed as a resettlement. Most of the chamber smelled of satisfaction. Inari listened to the decree. She accepted the formal notification chip when the conclave arbiter extended it. She placed it in her breast pocket with the care of someone pocketing something valuable. Then she turned to face the chamber, not the arbiter, not the display board, but the full-ranked gallery of 412 species looking down at her with the variety of expressions their anatomies permitted. "Give us 30 years," she said. Her translator rendered it cleanly into the conclave's 12 primary languages. The chamber processed this for a moment. Several species exchanged the equivalent of glances. The Verath delegation, SSK Thara's own, 6 figures in formal ochre wraps seated in the 3rd gallery tier, shifted their scent panels in what SSK Thara recognized as collective puzzlement. She smiled. That was the part that wouldn't leave SSK Thara's processing for a long time after. Not defiance, not grief, not the particular baring of teeth that human literature suggested might signal aggression. It was the expression of someone who had already solved a problem and was simply waiting for the room to catch up. SSK Thara filed a supplemental note in her log: human affect on expulsion, anomalous. Request cross-reference with Behavioral Xenopsychology Archive. Query: has any prior exiled species smiled? She already suspected what the archive would tell her. The escort was a formality, but it was also not a formality. 3 conclave enforcement vessels flanked the human delegation's transport from the moment it cleared the docking ring, maintaining precise formation intervals through the transit corridor and out to the edge of conclave map space. At the boundary marker, a navigational buoy that was technically just a piece of hardware and was technically also the edge of everything, the escort vessels peeled away. Inari watched through the transport's aft observation port. The station shrank. The enforcement vessels shrank. The boundary buoy shrank. The light of civilized space did not shrink because light didn't work that way, but the specific quality of it changed. The warmth of 1,000 networked relay beacons dropping away, and what was left was the sheer radiation bright in the wrong frequencies, gravitationally restless, home to 17 documented survey failures, and the skeletal remains of 2 species who tried to establish outposts before the data convinced them otherwise. She pressed her palm flat against the observation port's cold surface. The other human delegation members were already moving to the ship's communications suite, already running calculations, already pulling up every archived survey they'd accumulated over 60 years of formal galactic membership, during which they had quietly, methodically gathered every piece of data the conclave had ever produced on the sheer. Every radiation map, every gravitational survey, every failure report from the 17 species who'd looked at it and turned back. She listened to them work. She kept her hand on the glass until the boundary buoy was gone entirely. 30 years, she said to no one. The sheer swallowed them. 18 years later, the silence was the thing that worried SSK Thara. Not the absence of news that she had learned to expect. In the first years after the expulsion, there had been occasional reports, a human vessel detected at fringe range, a signal that might have been a beacon, raw electromagnetic data that analysts parsed for months and ultimately filed as environmental. Then the reports stopped, quietly, in the way that things stop when they have resolved into something else. SSK Thara was a senior intelligence analyst now, which was a title that meant she spent 12 hours per standard cycle in a room that smelled of her own concentrated thought compounds and processed information that other people found too tedious or too uncomfortable to process. The sheer file was hers, had been hers for 9 years, since the analyst before her retired and handed it over with the particular relief of someone setting down something heavier than it looked. She pulled it up now in the dim before the shift change, when the analysis suite was quiet, and she could think without the aromatic interference of 24 colleagues. 18 years of silence. She knew what the silence should mean. She knew what the conclave's xenopolitical models said it meant. A species without trade access, without diplomatic standing. Exiled to a radiation-hostile environment with technology adequate to survive for approximately 12 to 15 years before critical infrastructure degradation would require resupply. The models said the silence meant decline, dispersal, the quiet statistical vanishing of a species that had been given an impossible situation and responded to it the way most species responded to impossible situations. The models had not been updated. She authorized the probe mission herself, filing it under routine survey, technically accurate, since the sheer was technically conclave-adjacent space and technically subject to periodic environmental monitoring. The probe was small, fast, and equipped with the full sensory array her budget allowed, which was not insignificant because SSK Thara had learned to never let her budget shrink. It crossed the boundary marker at 0.7 light and transmitted continuously. The first 12 hours of data were consistent with the archival baseline. Elevated radiation flux, the characteristic gravitational churn of the outer arm, background electromagnetic noise at the frequencies she expected. Then the probe adjusted its trajectory toward the first of the shear's 12 viable gravitational anchor points, the positions where a species with sufficient engineering capability might theoretically establish stable orbital infrastructure, and the data stopped being consistent with anything. Structures, not debris, not the wreckage of the survey failures. Structures of a scale that required her to run the size estimation algorithm 3 times before she accepted the output, because the first 2 times she assumed instrument error. They were growing. That was the only accurate verb. The probe's comparative analysis, cross-referencing its imagery with the theoretical design parameters that engineers had once drafted in the early optimistic years of humanity's conclave membership, as proposals that were never approved, showed not a static installation but a system in active expansion. New sections accreted to old ones with the pattern of something following a blueprint. The material composition of the newer sections registered as partially biological. She sat with that for a long time. A species that could not access conclave supply chains. A species that had arrived in a radiation-hostile environment with 17 survey failures worth of documentation on why it couldn't be used. A species that had, in 18 years, built something so large the probe's field of view could not contain it. The probe reached the gravitational anchor point at hour 31. The signal came before she asked for it. A human voice, warmly modulated, carrying the particular acoustic signature of someone speaking into a long-distance array with the casual confidence of someone who had been expecting exactly this call. "Oh good, you found us. We were wondering when you'd check." SSK Thara set her scent panels to neutral and began composing a response. Her hands, when she noticed them, were not entirely steady. She filed this also as data, because data was the only honest framework she had left. The probe transmitted the coordinates they offered without being asked. She stared at the map for a long time. The structures weren't clustered around one anchor point. They weren't clustered around two. The shear had 12 viable gravitational anchors, and humanity had found all 12 and built on every one, and the space between them was not empty space anymore. Query revised, she wrote in her log. Decline hypothesis, rejected. Request upgrade to full intelligence assessment. She didn't sleep during the next 18 hours. Inari had not aged the way SSK Thara expected. SSK Thara had reviewed the Conclave's archived footage from the expulsion session enough times to have the original image precise in memory. A woman in her early 40s by human reckoning, silver beginning at the temples, the particular stillness of someone containing a great deal. 18 years was significant time by most species standards. It had done what 18 years did to biological organisms. What it had not done was diminished her. They met at the docking ring of what the humans called Anchor 3, the third of 12 stations, the one closest to the old conclave boundary, the one Inari had chosen for this meeting with the deliberateness of someone arranging furniture for a specific effect. SSK Thara had come alone, which was either a diplomatic statement or a personal choice or both. She had not entirely resolved which. She had filed the trip under a category that would not trigger review for 90 days. The station smelled wrong. Not wrong in the sense of hostile, wrong in the sense of alive. Most constructed environments smelled of their materials, metal oxide, polymer off-gassing, the sterile particular nothing of climate-controlled recycled atmosphere. Anchor 3 smelled of something growing, something photosynthesizing. A compound she could not immediately identify that triggered her olfactory array's pattern-matching subroutine and returned no known match, which meant it was either a novel organism or a novel compound derived from organisms, and either answer raised questions she had not prepared. The walls are partly biological, Inari said, reading the angle of SSK Thara's sensory organs with the accuracy that had unsettled SSK Thara from their first communication. Grew them from modified algal cultures, better radiation buffering than anything we could fabricate, and they self-repair. Coffee. SSK Thara accepted the coffee because refusing it seemed like the wrong move strategically, and also because the smell of it was the single most familiar thing in this entire environment, and she needed something familiar. They walked. The station was a different kind of architecture than anything in the Conclave's standard designs. It didn't follow the modular logic of built infrastructure, the clear delineation between structural section and operational section, the rational progression of space that engineering produced when you were working from fixed materials and fixed plans. It followed something more like the logic of growth, corridors that widened as the station had expanded, junctions that had developed organically when two growing sections met, walls that in places showed the layered history of the structure like geological strata. Old material, then newer material grown over it, then newer still. SSK Thara was cataloging weapons emplacements she couldn't find any other word for, even though Inari had not described them as weapons, and was walking past them with the ease of someone passing furniture. They were in the newer section, the biological walls here thicker, greener, still faintly luminescent with the metabolic activity of the algal colonies when the alarm sounded. Not a klaxon, a low resonant tone, almost subsonic, that SSK Thara felt in her secondary auditory membranes before her primary ones registered it. Inari's posture changed before the tone finished. Not fear, something more like the specific alertness of an organism that has evolved to respond to a particular signal. Pressure breach in growth section 12F, someone said, over the station's communication network. Membrane integrity at 40% and dropping. Two technicians appeared from a side passage at a pace that SSK Thara's movement pattern recognition filed as controlled urgency. They were carrying nothing she could identify. One of them had their hands already in their pockets, reaching for something, or already holding something, the gesture ambiguous, and then resolved as they produced a container the size of a closed fist and a tool that looked organic and was organic, she realized. A modified organism of some kind held between two fingers. "Excuse me," Inari said to SSK Thara, the way someone says it when they are going to watch, not leave. She watched. The breach was in the biological membrane of an expansion section, a new growth, still adolescent by the developmental markers SSK Thara was learning to read, the algal colony not yet fully integrated with the structural substrate. The pressure variance had created a microfracture. The fracture was spreading with the particular implacability of physics. On a standard installation, this would require evacuating the section, pulling the membrane, replacing the compromised material from stock, and waiting 72 hours for adhesion cure. The technician introduced something into the fracture. 4 minutes later, the fracture had closed. Not patched, closed, the biological membrane having responded to whatever had been introduced with what SSK Thara could only describe as enthusiasm, the algal colony extending filaments across the breach and knitting itself back together in real time while she watched. She looked at her instruments. Her instruments offered her nothing useful because they had not been designed to classify this. "Hungry bacteria," the technician said to SSK Thara, who was looking at the now sealed wall with her sensors still extended. "Introduce them engineered to metabolize membrane disruption and output cross-linking compounds. They eat the problem." "You grew a solution," SSK Thara said. The technician looked at Inari. Inari looked at SSK Thara with an expression that in a Verath would have signaled polite patience, and in a human appeared to mean something slightly different, something more like yes and. The tour continued. SSK Thara had come prepared with a map, the best available, assembled from probe data and the brief communications they'd exchanged before this visit. She had thought she understood the scale of what humanity had built here. She had thought the map was comprehensive. Inari waited until they were in the station's upper observation bay, a room that was one large curving viewport and nothing else, grown rather than constructed, the transparent section of modified organism that handled pressure and radiation simultaneously, to show her the actual map. The shear wasn't the edge of human territory. SSK Thara stood in front of the display for a long time. Her scent panels did not go to neutral. She did not have enough composure left for neutral. The shear was the center. The conclave's emergency session smelled of fear, even to SSK Thara, who processed fear as a copper-bright volatility in the air, a sharpness that had no pleasant analog. The chamber was close with it. 340 species in attendance, the galleries dense with bodies and the specific aromatic signatures of organisms under threat assessment stress, and underneath all of it the particular quality of a room that had been certain of something and had recently stopped being certain. She had filed her report 6 weeks ago. The classification was such that the senior counsel received it before anyone else, and for 3 weeks they had sat on it. She knew they had sat on it because she knew the counsel's processing times, and the gap between report submission and official response was longer than any legitimate review cycle. They had been deciding what to do with information they had not expected to receive. What they had decided, apparently, was this. The interdiction fleet was 300 vessels from the Conclave's 4 largest military contributors, assembled with the speed that political will could achieve when it was frightened enough. It was framed as a survey and assessment mission. No one in the chamber was using the word interdiction, but the fleet's composition made the word unnecessary. 300 ships, a third of them carrying armament packages that the Conclave's own treaties technically required notification to deploy, in formation toward the shear. SSK Thara was assigned as Conclave observer aboard the flagship. She suspected this was because the Council wanted someone who understood the situation and also wanted her where they could watch her. The transit took 9 days. She spent the 9 days reading everything she had. Every probe report, every communication log, every analysis she and her predecessors had produced across 18 years of a file that the previous analysts had found too heavy to carry for long. She read the construction methodology reports, how humans had used the shear's radiation flux as a power source rather than a hazard, how they had exploited the gravitational instability as a manufacturing condition, the precise oscillation of the shear's unusual gravity producing resonance effects that enabled fabrication processes unavailable in stable space. How they had taken 17 survey failures worth of documentation on what the shear couldn't do and used it as a materials science curriculum. The fleet dropped out of transit at the shear boundary. Standard interdiction protocol, form the perimeter, establish communication dominance, project force. The problem with the perimeter was the stations. Admiral Heth Voren, the Conclave fleet commander, a Prashidi, 4-limbed and methodical, a species that had not lost a naval engagement in 2 centuries, ran the spatial geometry of the interdiction formation and then ran it again. SSK Thara watched from the observation bridge as the tactical display populated with the shear structure. 12 major stations, the connective growth tendrils that linked them, the smaller subsidiary nodes that had grown along those tendrils over 18 years, the whole network forming a shape that was not a defensive formation, because it had not been built as a defensive formation. It was a living infrastructure that happened to render any conventional interdiction geometry into a tactical problem with no clean solution. Every approach vector that didn't pass through a station's operational sphere passed through a growth tendril's operational sphere. The stations and their connecting structures were positioned, had grown, at intervals that made the space between them as controlled as the space around them. Approaching the shear from any direction was approaching through human infrastructure. There was no outside of it to approach from. The Admiral ran the numbers a 3rd time. SSK Thara read the report over his shoulder. She was not supposed to read the report over his shoulder, but the bridge was small, and her sensory range was long, and the Admiral had not told her to leave. She processed the tactical assessment. She processed the estimated casualty projections for a forced entry engagement. She processed the secondary projections for what human infrastructure, once engaged, could do to a fleet operating inside its operational geometry. They were not projections. The Admiral had been provided before departure. She thought about the smile, 18 years ago on a conclave chamber floor. Give us 30 years, 8 short of the deadline. The humans had not needed 30 years. The communication request came before the Admiral finished his 3rd review. Inari's voice, over the fleet's primary channel. Warm. carrying the specific acoustic quality of someone who had been expecting this exact call. "Admiral, you're standing in our living room. Would you like tea?" Hethvorin looked at SSK Thara. He had not looked at her before. She was an observer, not a resource. He looked at her now with the expression of a very competent organism confronting data that his competence had not prepared him for. "She is offering hospitality," SSK Thara said. "In human social convention, this is significant. It means she does not consider you a threat." The Admiral absorbed this. "She doesn't consider us a threat," he repeated. "No," SSK Thara said. "I believe she considers you a guest who arrived unannounced." The fleet held position for 6 hours while the Admiral considered his options. SSK Thara did not tell him what she had concluded because she was an observer and her conclusions were filed elsewhere. She stood on the observation bridge and watched the shear through the viewport. The station's bioluminescent signatures visible at this range as a scattered warmth against the radiation-bright background. Alive, pulsing with the metabolic activity of algal colonies and engineered organisms, and 18 years of accumulated impossible work. And she thought about what it meant to be handed an attic and turn it into a kingdom. The Admiral sent a response to Inari's communication. He accepted the tea. The second vote was not close either. That was the part that felt like justice. 431 in favor, 14 abstentions, 7 against, the holdouts, the ones whose political calculus had not caught up with the reality the fleet's 6-hour standoff at the sheer boundary had introduced into the conversation. The recognition of human sheer sovereignty passed the conclave chamber with a completeness that left no practical avenue for appeal. SSK Thara sat in the diplomatic gallery and felt the mathematics of the moment settle around her like a change in atmospheric pressure. Inari was at the species lectern again. The same lectern. 18 years and however many light years of impossible construction separated this version of her from the one who had stood there and said, "Give us 30 years," and smiled. And the distance showed, in the lines of her face, in the silver that had spread from the temples to claim most of her close-cropped hair. But the stillness was the same. The absolute, unsettling stillness. She read the recognition decree in full. She accepted the formal chip when the arbiter extended it. She placed it in her breast pocket with the same care as the first one. She did not smile this time. She looked at the gallery, at the 431 species who had just voted to formalize what physics had already made true, with an expression that contained none of the triumph SSK Thara would have expected. None of the vindication. None of the particular human satisfaction that literature suggested should accompany the resolution of an injustice. She looked, if SSK Thara was reading her correctly, tired. Not defeated, not even sad. Tired the way something is tired when it has been carrying a weight for a very long time and has just been permitted to set it down, and the setting down reveals how long the carrying was. SSK Thara had moved her seat this session. She was in the diplomatic gallery still, but she had shifted from the Varath block seating to a position at the gallery's edge. A choice that had required submitting a position amendment 3 days before the session, and that had been noted by enough of her colleagues to constitute what her species would call a political statement. She was sitting beside Inari's empty seat. When Inari returned from the lectern, she sat down beside SSK Thara without comment. She tucked the recognition chip into her pocket. She looked out at the chamber. "You moved your seat," she said. "Yes," SSK Thara said. "That will cost you." "Yes," SSK Thara said. "I've modeled it." Inari looked at her then, really looked, with the focused attention that SSK Thara had learned meant a human was processing something that mattered to them. Her pheromone signature was doing something SSK Thara still didn't have a full taxonomy for. Something warm. Something that in her own species' biochemistry would have been associated with recognition, the specific compound released when a category error was corrected. "The conclave will be watching you," Inari said. The Conclave will be watching both of us, SSK Thara said. This is not new information. Inari looked back at the chamber. The session was concluding. Procedural wrap, diplomatic boilerplate, the machinery of interstellar governance producing its formal outputs. Around them, the gallery was processing its own reactions. Some species shifting away, some holding still. The complex social geometry of 431 independent civilizations recalibrating in real time. What does your report say? Inari asked. The final one. SSK Thara considered the question. She had filed the report that morning before the session because she had known what the vote would be. She had spent 3 weeks on it. She had written and discarded 11 versions. It says, SSK Thara said, that humans are not a threat. Inari waited. It says humans are a condition, SSK Thara continued. That the appropriate response is not military assessment or political containment or any of the frameworks we applied to your expulsion. It says the Conclave should plan accordingly. Plan for what? SSK Thara thought about the probe data, about the construction timelines, about the biological stations growing in the shear's radiation flux, eating the environment that had killed 17 survey expeditions and making infrastructure from the metabolism, about the 12 anchor points and the growth tendrils connecting them and the subsidiary nodes along those tendrils, the whole network alive and expanding and not finished. I don't know yet, she said. I don't think the data is complete. Inari smiled at that, a small one, nothing like the one from the chamber floor 18 years ago. This one was private. It was the expression of someone who already knew the answer and was deciding whether the other person had earned it yet. She reached into her other pocket, not the one with the recognition chip, and produced a folded document. She unfolded it. She set it on the armrest between them. It was a survey. New territories. Not the shear, beyond the shear into the deep outer arm where the Conclave's maps ended, and the designation was simply unmapped, and the surveys were not even theoretical yet. She had been scouting. Of course she had been scouting. I gave you 30 years, Inari said. You checked in at 18. SSK Thara looked at the survey. She looked at Inari. She looked at the chamber below them, where the formal recognition of human sheer sovereignty was being recorded into conclave archives. The ink, metaphorical, the records were energy rather than chemistry, but the metaphor persisted, still wet. May I see the rest of it? SSK Thara said. Not a question. The particular grammatical register of someone who has already decided. Inari handed her the document. Outside the conclave's great curved viewports, in the middle distance where the station's external illumination gave way to unmediated space, a single human growth tendril station hung in the black, not one of the 12, but a relay node, a smaller node placed to extend communication range to this part of settled space. It pulsed faintly. The bioluminescent signature of the algal colony, alive and photosynthesizing in the light of a borrowed sun, tending itself, growing, doing what living things do when they are given enough time and room. SSK Thara held the survey document and did not put it down.